Today in this podcast we're going to be having a look at commas again, and this time I want to look at the way in which you use commas in parenthesis. That is to say, when you use them parenthetically to insert a word or a phrase into a sentence, that it interrupts the sentence but it doesn't affect the meaning of the sentence. Okay, in other words, this is where you might drop a word, however, or a whole clause or a phrase into a sentence in order to say something parenthetically. You surround it by commas, and if you took it out, the sentence would still make sense. It doesn't have to be in there. It's not necessary for it to be in there. So it adds something to the sentence, but is not essential to the sentence. Okay, let's have a look at some examples. The simplest examples are, as I said, those words like however, moreover, understandably, therefore, on the other hand, to take one example. Those kinds of words and phrases that you use all the time in your writing to form conjunctions, to make the text flow better, to mount an argument, to balance one point with another point. Okay, so you use parentheses quite a lot, and therefore whenever you're doing so, you must remember that those commas come in pairs. There has to be one before the phrase or the word, and there has to be one after. So you have to think about the commas being like brackets. That's to say, you could pick up the whole clause and pull it out of the sentence with its commas, and the sentence would come back together and still read correctly. Let's look at a few examples. The Right Honourable Member for East Victoria Park is, comma, moreover, comma, an incompetent fool. There is no Right Honourable Member for East Victoria Park, of course. You can see here that moreover has been dropped into that sentence, and it is separated on both sides by commas. It's being used parenthetically here. You could, of course, use moreover at the start of the sentence. You could say, moreover, the Right Honourable Member for East Victoria Park is an incompetent fool, and in that case, of course, you would start the sentence with moreover, it would be followed by the single comma, and you would move on. But in the case where you're dropping that clause or that phrase or that word into the middle of the sentence, and it can be taken out again without affecting the meaning of the sentence, it must be bordered on both sides by commas. Another example, the new Harry Potter film, comma, you'll be sorry to hear, comma, is even worse than the last. Again, you could say you'll be sorry to hear that the new Harry Potter film is even worse than the last, in which case you wouldn't need any commas in that sentence at all. But if you were going to use that phrase, you'll be sorry to hear, parenthetically, you're dropping it into a sentence that doesn't have to have it. In other words, it could be the new Harry Potter film is even worse than the last. You're using it parenthetically, it has to have commas on both sides of it. The final example I've got here, the Queen's loyal husband, Prince Philip, put his foot in it again. And you're often going to be using parenthetical commas for names. The Queen's loyal husband, comma, Prince Philip, comma, put his foot in it again. Again, you could say Prince Philip, comma, the Queen's loyal husband, put his foot in it again, but where you're using it as parenthetically, it needs the commas on both sides of it. There are some more complex examples we could look at though. Have a look at this one. The inexperienced writer, comma, who will always struggle at first with rules like parenthetic commas, comma, became an expert punctuator from reading as widely as possible. And of course we do become expert punctuators by reading as widely as possible. But we see here that the inexperienced writer became an expert punctuator from reading as widely as possible. That's the sentence. What's been put in parenthesis is this idea that the writer will always struggle at first with rules like this one, parenthetical commas or parenthetic commas. So it's quite a complex clause that's been put in parenthetically. There it needs commas on both sides of it as well. So the inexperienced writer, comma, who will always struggle at first with rules like this, comma, became an expert, and so on. Okay? Now where you're making your mistake, or where your writer would be likely to be making a mistake and you would need to be looking at it to check as a proofreader, is where they've included only one of those two commas. And when I explain the rule to you here, it seems absolutely obvious that there ought to be two commas, but you'd be surprised how often people drop one of those commas, or they're not sure which one should be there and which one shouldn't be, and so on. So you often get something like the Right Honourable Member for East Victoria Park is, moreover, comma, an incompetent fool, or The new Harry Potter film, comma, you'll be sorry to hear, is even worse than the last. So having the first comma but not the second, or the second comma but not the first. And especially in these more complex examples like the inexperienced writer, people are really unsure whether it needs the two commas. It must have the pair. In other words, when you're using a clause parenthetically or a word or a phrase parenthetically, commas come in pairs.